So I decided to bring you guys some data regarding which are the richest countries in the world. We're going to look at it from a few different perspectives. The first one, which I found in Reddit actually, is the disposable income of countries with the highest average monthly net salaries in 2020. It's interesting to look at. It's still an average, which is not ideal because we always want to look at medians to see how the average person is doing, or how the normal person is doing. But averages are still fairly decent. And we see the US at a solid third here, behind Switzerland and Luxembourg, which are pretty small countries. Switzerland, not so much. I mean, it's nearing 10 million people, so it's definitely significant. Whereas Luxembourg doesn't even have 1 million. So Denmark is right behind the US, and there's Singapore, Australia, Norway, Qatar, Iceland, Netherlands. It's mostly countries in Europe, the US. You clearly see that smaller countries do better than larger countries because even in Europe, Switzerland, Luxembourg, Denmark, are fairly small. Australia is small population wise, even if it's not geographically. And at the lower level here, which is still high because those are only the highest countries up, right? There's Austria, there's South Korea, there's Belgium, Canada, Israel, France. So this is interesting to look at. It, I guess, it gives you an idea of more or less the upper middle class. It doesn't actually give you an idea of the middle class because those are averages, not medians, but it's still an interesting graph to look at. And the US does seem to be better off than most people would have expected for the middle class. But I guess some people would say that the problem in the US is more related to crime and to the lower class. So it would make sense for this data to be that way, even so. Uh, yeah, so the second thing I wanted to look at is the percentage of millionaires, because, well, this video is titled The Richest Countries, right? So we should look at rich people. And obviously, it doesn't really make sense to see it by number of absolute millionaires, because the US is obviously going to win just because the US is so much larger than everyone else. I think it's pretty clear that if we did this, yeah, the US has 4 times more millionaires than the second largest country, just China. But as a percentage, it would be interesting. So Switzerland again comes in number one at 15%, which is insane. Imagine, like, that's what, 1 in 7 probably. Yeah, it's 1 in 7 adults is actually a millionaire, cash US dollar millionaire, which is very, very impressive. Hong Kong is about the same, a little bit less. Singapore a little bit less. Australia and New Zealand were actually quite surprising to me, because if we look at the previous graph, I think New Zealand is kind of in the bottom here, and even Australia is not in the top. But if you look at the percentage, Australia and New Zealand even go above the US here. So that's actually quite impressive. We have the Netherlands, we have Denmark. You see that that Denmark and Norway seem to be a little bit better than Sweden, because if we compare it to this graph as well, Denmark is the one that's right behind the US, and Norway's over here, whereas Sweden is all the way back here. And I've heard it from Swedish people as well that Sweden is a little bit poorer than its counterparts in the Nordics. So that's also interesting to look at. And yeah, there's a bunch of countries here: Portugal, Italy. What else is interesting? Brazil's at 0.1%, which is pretty low. Iran, Egypt, Philippines, and India's that last at 0.08, which is very sad to think about because it's 0.08, and also it's a huge country, which means that, like, a lot of people being born there really are not being given the opportunities to grow. And that's something, I guess, the world they have to deal with, and the world has to deal with together. But yeah, Switzerland definitely again at number one. Luxembourg didn't appear here, maybe because it didn't count. I'm not sure, but it would probably, if it did, it would probably be high up here as well. But again, Australia, the US, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Switzerland seem to be doing pretty well with regards to millionaires. And now, with regards to billionaires, same thing. If we do it just by absolute numbers, then the US is actually double what China is. India comes third. There's Italy, Brazil, Russia, the UK. But again, rates are much more interesting. Monaco obviously is a city state, and mostly billionaires moved there. So I'm not even sure if being born in Monaco and, like, being from Monaco is actually that good for you to become a billionaire, because I feel like most of people who are living there are from abroad anyway. Same for Liechtenstein. I think it's the same problem. It's going to be a high quality of life, but I would suggest that probably actually, it's only one billionaire. They're very small countries. It's hard to compare. St. Kitts and Nevis, that is very unexpected. I think it's because it probably sells citizenships. So I'm guessing it's someone from abroad who came there, but it could be wrong. Let's ignore those. Just islands. Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland, Sweden, Barbados, Israel, Iceland, and the US. The US is actually number 11. One thing to consider here as well is, depending on how many billionaires there are, if there are very little, but also the country is very small, it gets completely distorted, right? Because if a country has 100 people and then a billionaire comes in, then 1% of all of them is a billionaire, but does that really count, because It's just one person, so it gets quite distorted. But I wonder, yeah, it is absolute numbers. So yeah, it's true. Some of those countries like Liechtenstein, even Monaco, Cyprus, it gets distorted because like it's too small. Just one up or one down makes a lot of difference. For Switzerland and Sweden, I think not, because, well, 43 people in Sweden, that's already very significant. 41 in Switzerland, 39 in Singapore, 67 in Hong Kong, that's very significant. And then in the US, 813, obviously very significant as well. Last but not least, going back to, to more realistic standards, we've looked at billionaires and we've looked at millionaires and we've looked at, let's say, upper middle class. That's what the average in the first data would suggest. The US is doing pretty well in all of them, but some other countries are doing even better. I would say Switzerland is probably the one that's doing best. Hong Kong is doing pretty well. Singapore, yeah, Norway, even Sweden, though Sweden was a little bit lower on the last few graphs. It was only a little bit higher on the billionaire one. But let's consider now this graph over here, which is honestly very interesting. This one puts Luxembourg on top and literally every level, and it doesn't have Switzerland, so it's a little bit limited. But and it's also from 2010, so not that yeah, up to date. At least I'm in 2024 now, so it's a little bit later, 14 years. But the interesting thing with this one is obviously if we get the upper income, the US is second, close to Norway and Denmark again. So like you can see, those seem to be the better off countries in Europe besides Luxembourg and Switzerland. For the middle class, middle income, the US is also second after Luxembourg, and it's also Norway and Denmark just behind, so not too different from the other graphs. It is the lower income that's actually interesting. You would expect the lower income in the US to be low, because I think that's the main claim, that poor people in the US struggle. But if you consider the median, and already it's not average, so that's good, disposable income, the US is actually almost identical to Denmark, and I think it tops up at like fourth or third here, something like that. So, and it's better than Germany, Finland, France, Ireland, the UK, Spain, and Italy. So that's also very interesting. To answer the topic of the video, if you're going to be like the luckiest person, then yeah, maybe being born in Liechtenstein and Monaco is the best, but it's like a 1 in a billion kind of chance. For Singapore and Switzerland, it's a little bit more realistic. It's a little bit easier to move to those countries as well compared to those nation states. So those are definitely countries to look up to. But honestly, on a sheer scale, if you think about it, the US just gives so much more opportunity for everyone else. I would definitely still say that it's the richest country in the world.